Hey everyone, so in this video, I'm going to talk to you about how to go from your time log to a data visualization and how you can do that by telling a story with your data. So the big question for this assignment is how do we go from this time log that we've been doing for a week to a data visualization that answers some sort of question? So at its very heart, a data visualization is some sort of graphical representation of data, right? It's a way that lets us see data and process it visually. So we need to figure out a way to go from this time log that's not very visual to something that is. So the first step in converting your data to a data visualization is asking, what's the question I'm trying to answer, right? So here we've sort of asked that for you. And it's how does spending time on certain activities affect your emotional state? You might also want to answer a question about how spending time on certain types of activities affects how much time you have for other activities and maybe how that affects your emotional state. So the first step might be to write down a few hypotheses that address this question. So what sort of relationships in your data do you think you might see? And what sort of questions, more specifically, other than the sort of like broad and vague one, what sort of questions specifically are you interested in? So the next step is to look for patterns. And there's some ways that we can sort of systematically do that and some tools we can use. So the first is to categorize your time log. And so that means going through it and sort of figuring out how you can create categories out of what you were doing so that you can see a pattern. And a lot of times the most useful thing to do is to actually color code your time log itself. So that means either print out a physical copy and have some highlighters ready, or you can do this electronically in Excel just by shading the boxes different colors. It's also useful to note that if you have very specific categories, you'll have more categories, right? So if you think of like, you could categorize watching TV all in one big category, or you could categorize the different shows you watch into multiple categories. So I spent this much time watching The Office and this much time watching movies. Or you could classify things like video games, TV, all as entertainment. Or you could separate them into separate categories like TV and video games, right? And too many categories might make it hard to see patterns, but too few categories might make you miss important phenomenon. So you might even try multiple sort of coding schemes for how you categorize. All right, so here's an example. And this is just of one morning and how you might categorize it. So you can see that I've categorized as sleep, all is the same thing. But then even within a given time slot, you might categorize multiple things, right? So you can see here, scrolling Instagram and checking social media, I have all as this green category. And email I have as all this like darker blue. But you can see that within a given half hour, I might have scrolled Instagram and checked my email. So I have both of those in that time slot. You can also see here that even if within class, I've coded that as different categories. So this might also relate to what your hypothesis is. So if I had a hypothesis and I'm concerned about reducing stress, and I know I feel some stress in class, so I'm curious what type of class makes me feel the most stressed. I might categorize sort of different activities we do in class as sort of different categories, right? And that might give me different answers and change how I prepare for class or something like that. So this is an example of one scheme. The other thing you can do here to sort of help you see patterns is for your emotion, since you're already ranking this on a 0 to 10 scale, is pick one color, designate lighter versions of that color as lower, darker versions of that color as higher numbers, and then you'll be able to sort of visually assess patterns and quantities that way as well. All right. So the reason that this is an important step to getting towards the data visualization is that this is actually creating this time log that's hard to like process when you just look at it. It's creating something that's more visual, right? So we're stepping towards it's easier to visually process data. This is getting us one step towards actually visualizing it by color coding it. All right. So once you've color coded your entire time log, then you can start to look for patterns, all right? When you have darker colors for your emotion, meaning that you're experiencing that emotion more, what does that look like it corresponds to? Do you get those darker colors more often during certain times of the day when you're doing particular types of activities? The other reason that you might want a really detailed categorization here is that you might also see something like, I get more stressed the more that I'm multitasking. I get more stressed when my schedule is changing quickly and I'm doing like a lot of different things in a short amount of time. You can see sort of the patterns you see don't have to just be I was doing activity A and I felt emotion B. It can be, where you were doing activities, how many activities you were doing. So there's a lot. This is very open-ended, and sort of categorizing your data different ways might help you see different patterns. Right. So this is an example of a with less specific and fewer categories, right? Where everything in class doesn't matter if the class format was different or the modality was different. I've categorized it all the same way. You can also see at the bottom where I said I was working on homework, I've categorized as this red color, even though during some of that time I might have been working on homework and watching Netflix, and another time I was working on my homework and also checking Instagram and sort of like going back and forth between things, right? So this is an example of how you might categorize things, and to show how if you're less specific, you have fewer categories. Right. It's also helpful to calculate some descriptive statistics for your categories. So you might find the mean, median, and standard deviation for how much time you spend in a given day. So like what's the average amount of time per day you spend on schoolwork? And then you can ask like, what things are you consistently spending time on? What things do you spend the most time on? And how does that correspond to your mood? This might be useful because the interesting pattern you might see is that if there's more, you might notice that like the variation in how much time you spend on schoolwork causes you to feel more prepared or less prepared, or more anxious or less anxious. So those are another useful way. It's not really a visual way of seeing patterns, but it's another way that you might notice patterns in your data. Right. So for example, this is just sort of imaginary data about stress and watching TV. So if you're going to calculate descriptive statistics for this, what I've done here is added up on Monday. If I'm ranking stress from 1 to 10, I just added all of those up for that day, and you get like a score of 150. And then the same for watching TV. So you'll notice I'm not going to do all the calculations out right here, but watching TV, for example, is something that has a high degree of, or has a high standard deviation, especially compared to the mean. And so the data on watching TV is very spread out, right? You can guess that, right? There's clearly on Sunday a binge, versus there are 2 days where you don't watch any TV. And so that's sort of an interesting, you might see that like there are certain activities that have high standard deviations and certain activities that have low standard deviations where you consistently do those, and other things you don't consistently do. So that's another way to see patterns. So at this point, right, getting from your time log to a data visualization is not this like super linear, straightforward path. Now it's time to sort of loop back and refine the question. So you saw some patterns, you maybe learned some things about yourself. And so now it's time to decide what exactly you want your question and what you want to be communicating in your data visualization. So you should narrow down exactly what you want to talk about. Because this question about how does spending time on certain activities affect your emotional state, you should be able to like answer a very specific question instead of this general one. So it might be something like, how does the amount of time I spend on homework affect my stress? How much, or how does spending time multitasking affect my stress? Right, so this is like the specific question you are going to be answering. And you should be able to answer that in a couple sentences. And you're going to communicate that answer and tell that story with your data. So the next question is figuring out how you want to organize and present your data. Chronologically is going to make the most sense for a lot of people, but we're going to go through a couple examples from the Dear Data project where they organize their data different ways. But you want this to best communicate that answer to that question, right? So if you find that your activities and your emotional level are also sort of correlated with the time of day, you might want to organize your data by that. If you find that it seems like there's some sort of pattern with where you are on campus, you might want to include that, right? So I'm also going to go over some sort of basic types of data visualizations before we jump into some of the Dear Data examples. So you're starting with this color-coded time log, right? And this is just a snippet of one, so yours will look a lot bigger. And we want to take it from this to some graphic representation of the data meant to communicate the pattern that you noticed, right? So technically coloring it like this is a data visualization, but we don't want to include all of the information in your time log, right? We just want to communicate a particular argument that you noticed from a pattern in your data, right? So this is like writing a paper in a way that you don't want to include unnecessary information. You want to narrow down what your specific argument is and what evidence best supports that argument. And then creating the data visualization is sort of like writing out that argument in the best way possible. So one of the most common forms of data visualization is a scatter plot. So in a scatter plot, there are points on a coordinate plane to show the relationship between two things. So in this example, it's from a trucking company and it's showing miles driven per month and the cost per mile. So if you look down on the x-axis, which is the horizontal one, it's miles driven per month. And then on the vertical or y-axis, it's cost per mile. So if you had a driver who drives 1,000 miles per month and it costs them $250, you can see that there's a data point if you go over to 1,000 on the x-axis and then up to 250, there's a dot there representing that driver who drives 1,000 miles per month and it costs $250 per mile, right? And then you do that for all of your drivers and then you can see this relationship between two variables. You can also then add things to your data visualization, like color or lines to emphasize a pattern, right? So this is adding color for the cost per mile drivers who are above average and adding a line with the average. So what this is communicating is that to get a below average cost per mile, you want those drivers who are driving between maybe 1,800 and 3,200 miles per month. And once you get over 3,200 miles or below 1,800, then the cost per mile starts to be above average. So that's what this data visualization is showing, and it's pretty simple to get there. Another common data visualization is line graphs. So line graphs are particularly helpful to show how something changes across time, right? So this is showing some quantity as it changes from January to May, right? And where the graph or where the line is how high that observation was in that month, right? So in January, whatever this was measuring was like at a 4, and then in February it was up to 5, and you just sort of connect the dots in a line and you can see trends over time. You can also use multiple series. You can see here there's like ABC in the middle panel, ABCD in the last panel. To show multiple different things. So you could show maybe over the course of a week here how much time you spent on an activity and your emotional state. You can also use line graphs to show ranges. So the shaded area here is showing the minimum and maximum here in addition to the average. So you might show the average amount per day you spend or the average amount of time you're spending maybe in a certain hour of the day, like you average 15 minutes of social media in the morning, but one time, or between 9 and 10 a.m. But one day you spent an hour on social media and another day you didn't spend any time on social media. So the shaded area would show that range, right? So this is showing the minimum and maximum. So it shows the range in how you spend your time. And then one of the most common forms of data visualization is the bar graph. In a bar graph, the height of each bar corresponds to some value. Right? You can also add multiple categories as well to show more than one thing. So you could show an activity and an emotion next to each other. Right? So those are all probably data visualizations you've come across either as a consumer of information or as a producer of it. So the thing is, the Dear Data examples look a lot more complicated than that. So how do you go from those pretty simple graphs, which are totally valid data visualizations, to these sort of more artistic and compelling ones? So this is where it's a little bit artistic flair and it's a little bit of creativity, but it sometimes really helps you communicate differently. So what I want to start with is an example. Again, this is just made up data. For a given day, or given like hour of the day, this is the average amount of time you maybe spend on social media and the average stress you feel during that hour, right? So this is just a bar graph. And this is fine. This probably communicates what you're looking for. But since you're showing data over time, think about the natural way people think about time, right? And that's with the clock, maybe. So the fundamentals of data visualization are that you're showing quantities of information and their relationship with things like length, height, placement in shape, in space, color, areas, and shapes. So that's the basics. Those are sort of like the laws of data visualization that you can't break. Other than that, you can be creative. So instead of a bar graph showing time, you could arrange this, those quantities around a clock, right? So instead, now the height of the bars is still showing the same thing. But now instead of sort of arranged horizontally, it's around the clock. So you can see that in the morning you spend less time on social media, and you spend the most time on social media sort of mid-morning and in late at night. And then you can also be creative about sort of how you show things like emotion. So if it's stress, right, you could use like emojis or smiley faces, sad faces, to show the degree to which you feel that emotion, right? So this is a way that it's not doing anything super complicated, but it's just using how we perceive time, which is around a clock face, which is how we naturally think of time, and just sort of spinning your bar graph around it, right? And that's sort of a more interesting data visualization. But again, right, data visualization at its heart is about showing quantities of information and relationship between information with things like length, height, placement in space, color, area, and shapes, right? So you could add to this and show, you could color the bars by which type of social media you were using. You could do lots of different things. So I want to go through a couple examples from the Dear Data project of data visualizations that look complicated but really aren't. So this is an example of one that one of the authors does arrange sort of around a clock face. So on this one, they're tracking how often they actually look at a clock, which is also part of why they arranged it like a clock face. So each line going out is a day of the week, and you can see that on the legend they provide. So it's very important on your data visualization to show on the backside how to read your data visualization. And then each of those sort of spindles going out is an hour of the day, and it's broken into line segments representing 7 days of the week. And then on the day of the week, in that hour, what sort of clock do they look at and how often? So in the very center of the clock is like Monday, and then like an outer ring is Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, and then you can go around and see the relationship between a particular hour of the day as well, right? And they're using shapes to show different types of clocks they look at, right? So this is using placement in space, it's using quantities, and it's using shapes to show the data, right? So you can look at this and say like, oh, early in the morning, they don't look at the clock that often. They look at the clock a lot more often sort of towards the end of the day, right? So you can see patterns like that in this data visualization. So this one, one of the authors was showing how often and to who they say thank you during the week. So this is a more linear representation of time. And it's pretty similar to a scatter plot. They have, if you look at the legend here, each day is represented by a horizontal line, right? So it's like Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, etc. And then these triangles representing one thank you are spaced out according to time of day, right? So this is essentially a scatter plot. If you look at it, you wouldn't be like, oh yeah, it's a scatter plot, because it looks kind of cool. But that's really what it is. They chose triangles instead of dots, which is interesting. And then they shaded those triangles to show who they were saying thank you, or how close they were to the person saying thank you. So you can look at this and see, right, if it's early in the morning and Monday, right, it's like you go over to that hour of the morning and up to that day, and that's where you would point or plot a triangle for saying thank you. So you can see like very interesting patterns here. So like they don't say thank you in the morning very often. Their thank yous happen the most midday. You can also see that the darker the triangle, like the closer the lines are together in the triangle, so the darker it looks, is people that are very close to her. She doesn't say thank you often to her husband, who's the darkest triangle up in the corner. And so that was something she learned about herself from this particular data visualization. right? So this is a way that this is a very basic data visualization, but just by like changing the shape and sort of shading it in a different way, it looks like really interesting and very cool. So this is, again, the same sort of concept about how to show time, that each line is a day of the week and the hours are progressing on the x-axis. So days of the week are on the y-axis, going up and down, and time of day is on the horizontal axis. And this time, instead of triangles, they use these ovals where the size and shape of the oval correspond to how many people they encounter, right? So that's what this is showing, is how many people are you around at a certain time of day. So I like this in comparison to the other one because it's organizing the data in the exact same way. And a lot of you might find that this is how you want to organize your data as well, because it's pretty straightforward. But then all they're doing is making a small change in the shape they use and using color instead of shading. And you get a very different looking data visualization. And it's still sort of the same concept though, right? That they're using color and size and shape to show different quantities of information. Right? So from this, it's really easy to tell, when does this person see people? When is this person around a lot of people? In the mornings, it looks like they tend to be alone a lot more. And then in the afternoons, they're around a lot more people, right? So you can see those patterns really easily. So this is an example that's totally different and not organized by time. In this one, it's actually, this particular week for the authors was very similar to what you're doing with your time log, where they had to track how they spent their time. And so the author in this particular data visualization represented different types of activities, right? She categorized her data, and the different categories are represented with a particular color. And there's a line representing like a particular amount of time you spent doing that. So the sort of flowers here that are bigger mean you spent more time on them. And here, the spacing from like left to right or up and down doesn't actually mean anything. It's totally just size and color that's telling you information here. But you could add to this, like if you wanted to do something similar, you could arrange it over time or days of the week or by stress. So you could say like, or you could add something like leaves for stress or something like that. So you could add a lot to this to make it work for you. But this is someone organizing their data based on sort of the categories of what they were doing rather than organizing it chronologically, right? You might also want to organize it spatially to show where you were doing certain things. Almost impose it on like a Cornell map. There's a lot of different ways you can choose to organize your data. And it doesn't have to be complicated. Chronologically might be the sort of easy answer or the most natural answer. But there's a lot of different things you can do with your data. You don't have to make things, these data visualizations by the authors look sort of unattainable, but they're using these basic principles of using length, height, placement in space, color, area, and shapes to show quantities and relationships between quantities. So the central takeaways for getting your time log into data form. First, remember these basic tools that size, color, shape, placement all matter. And make sure that your figure is showing what you say that it does. And part of that is also making sure you have a legend on the back with detailed instructions on how to interpret your data visualization. So if space or color or shape means something, that information should be on your legend. And you can sort of have it as like a walkthrough, like here's how you should read this. And then the last thing is I want to talk about the tools you can use to make your data visualization. Like the authors, you can hand draw this on a 4x6 index card, which is what they used. You can also use Excel, at least to get parts of this. If you want to do this electronically, the clock graph I just made in PowerPoint with icons and shapes. If you're comfortable and familiar, Adobe Illustrator is a great place where you can sort of draw things and create data visualizations. And then finally, for like freehand drawing on a computer or tablet, sketchbook.com is a great free app for drawing. So have fun with this. It's an open-ended sort of assignment that you can be as creative as you want to. But if you remember these basic tools, you should be able to go from your time log to a data visualization that answers a question, helps you learn about your time management skills.